So with that, I'll introduce our speaker today. Imruh Bakari is a filmmaker, writer, and creative industries consultant. He studied at Bradford College of Art and is a graduate of the National Film and Television School. He also completed postgraduate studies at Goldsmith College, University of London. He teaches on the BA Hons Film and Studies and BA Hons at Film Production Programs. From 1999 to 2004, he was Festival Director of Zanzibar International Film Festival and is a founder director of Tanzania Screenwriters Forum. He was a founder director of SEDO, the film and video production and training organization in London from 1982 to 1993. He's a former member from 2012 to 2015 of the Advisory Council of the Pan-African Federation of Filmmakers, and currently a member of the Tanzania Independent Producers Association and the editorial board of the Journal of African Cinemas. His professional work includes a number of film and television credits, which include Riots and Rumors of Riots, Street Warriors, The Mark of the Hand, Blue Notes and Exiled Voices, and African Tales. In 2003, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Africa Film Festival in Leuven, Belgium, for his work in African cinema. So without further ado, Bakari.
Okay, thank you very much, and for that little introduction, which I'm not usually accustomed to hearing all of that stuff. But I've just put out a book of poems, which I think is more important than all of that. It's just come out 1 month ago, called Without Passport or Apology. So I hope you go and have a look at it. That's the real me, you know, filmmakers. I do when I have other people's money. And, you know, anyway. Thank you very much for the introduction, and also in spite of the minimum numbers here, we will push on and hopefully people will catch up. I just wanted to pick up on your own introductory remarks. And one thing, the first thing in terms of reflecting on the aims and objectives which are on the sheet, is the link between education, knowledge, and culture. Education, knowledge, and culture. And culture in terms of the way we live. That's what I mean when I refer to culture. You know, the way we live. I know some people say we are defending our culture, or this is my culture because of what I wear. But these for me are symbols of culture. The culture is how I live with people day to day, which means cultures change, cultures, you know, incorporate, are very dynamic. Okay. The second thing is the question of technology in introducing the session, and these are summaries of the other 2 sessions. They're on the sheet. The question of technology and learning. People will talk about technologies of learning, but you can talk about technology and learning. And since we are mentioning it, we need to think about how have we learned things in our lifetime, firstly. And then how have people learned things over time? Okay? For example, you know, there was a point where, you know, Europeans said, well, Africans have never written anything, therefore they don't have any history, they don't have any this, etc., etc., etc. The question of, and then when Africans turn to Africa, they look and they think, where is my books and so on? And usually they can't find them. Not because they're not there, but they can't find them. Nobody went. Today, Timbuktu is one of the greatest repository of manuscripts, books, knowledge, African knowledge. The fact that it is Islamic is important, but let's say African knowledge. Yet most people don't have access to it for 2 reasons, well, among others. One, this knowledge is in the private collections of families who have protected and guarded this knowledge, these collections over centuries. That's one reason. The other reason is that nobody can read it. They wrote in Arabic script or using Arabic script, but the words are African languages. as used to be the case in East Africa when Swahili was written, or most people in Africa wrote in Arabic script. So here we are. In a modern contemporary society, our universities are using books from UK, etc., German books, Spanish books, French books, but you can't read the African languages. Well, one, you don't probably know the language, and two, because it's written in a script that is no longer in use. And that non-use is only recent. The second question is, and this is something I'll pick up on probably in the next session later on, or maybe a little bit in this one, but carry it over, I'll talk about that in a minute, is the question of writing in Africa. And the way in which the Afrocentrists, and the sort of the real Afrocentrist, African nationalists speak about the ancient African civilizations when we were kings, etc., which, I have my own comment on, I'll come to that in a minute. But the whole question of writing and knowledge does not take into consideration the way societies were organized. There was a time in Britain when most people couldn't read and write. It was not necessary, it was not required. Similarly, there was a time when most people in Africa didn't read and write because it wasn't necessary or required. Writing was the role of a specific class or profession of people. Okay? Here in Britain, modern society with technology, when you take a man to court, for example, for a crime, you want him to at least read the charge, so it's important he can read. In a cynical way, that's one of the reasons why universal education is necessary. Because they want people to read the rules, and they want them to know when they're going to jail and for how long, basically. Right? So the whole question of knowledge, in all societies, mass knowledge was not necessary for all of the population. As societies transform, these things become more important. But there's also the transformation of knowledge, how knowledge is transferred. There's a very interesting book called The Walking Quran, right? Which talks really about the tradition of pedagogy, knowledge transference in Africa, in an African society, particularly where Islamic education is important. So these things are important because it also links to the Caribbean and the diaspora, on how certain kinds of knowledge is passed on, passed down, and inherited. Okay? We'll come to the significance. Just hold this in our heads for a little while. The third thing you mentioned is your own family history. When Ishmael told me your name, I said, is she from Sierra Leone? And now you can see the reason why I said that. But she's from Guinea. Of course, why Sierra Leone, why Guinea? It's one country, basically. And you talk about your mother and father meeting in Liberia, Senegal, it's the same country. Okay, but I don't know Guinea as well as I know Sierra Leone. Okay, and then you tell me your mother is Jamaican, etc. So it confounds everything that the name Kaba stereotypically should signify. And this is an African dynamic. This tells us something about history and the way in which we live and come to be who we are. And this is important, especially for African Caribbean people who have been given names and are then reclaiming names, right? And then you go to somewhere in Africa, for example, and somebody says, what is your name? And you tell them, oh. Then you say, no, I'm from the Caribbean. You say, okay, how come? Say, yes, we have them there too, right? So these are the kinds of sensitivities and awareness that we need if we're going to be dealing with archives, if we're going to be encountering what I talk about later as challenges and some of the issues that we're going to have to negotiate and go through. Okay. The first session, beyond Google, learning how to learn. I won't speak a lot about Google. I won't speak about learning how to learn, but I'm going to some ideas, and I hope interactive we will see the focus of what I'm saying. Okay, right. How did you know I needed this? I want to start by referring to the presentation I did in March, the Everyday Muslim presentation. And this was the name of the symposium, and I presented a paper, or summarized the paper, Africa in the Atlantic Triangle, Narratives, Archives, and Identities. Since then, I've done it again, and I realized I wasn't talking about a triangle at all. I was talking about a circle. And a circle figuratively has a certain dynamic, even within African tradition, about constant flow. And I was moving from the triangle, or first the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. And if I was going to go beyond that, like I'm going beyond Google, I realized that really what I'm talking about is a circle. And that kind of dynamic flow of knowledge, people, events that is part of the history we're talking about. So, the focus of the presentation was introduced by referencing that presentation, referencing the contemporary social and political context as a reference point for understanding and defining what might be meant by Black Muslim in British history and heritage. Okay? I noted in that discussion current situations whereby work in and with archives has taken on a new and important meaning in British society and globally. In other words, our preoccupation with talking about archives is not unique to us. Within the last decade or so, 20 years perhaps, the whole idea of archives and archiving, museums has become a very significant subject. The Musée de l'Homme in Paris has just reopened. It was closed for, I don't know, I have the data somewhere, about 5 or 10 years of refurbishment. They spent millions of euros refurbishing one of the oldest museum spaces in Europe, and it's been recently reopened. Why? Okay? So things are happening. British Museum has had some major exhibitions. Tourists, it's become a revived institution in the last few years. But I also mentioned a number which would be or could be relevant just as reference points. I mentioned the Endangered Archives Program, which the British Library is part, they are one of the partners in Britain. But it's a global initiative, UNESCO, etc. And that's part of their work is looking after the Timbuktu archives and manuscripts, okay, with a number of people. I mentioned that for obvious reasons, but I also mentioned others like the George Padmore Institute in Finsbury Park, also in the same building as the first black bookshop in UK, New Beacon Books. The Huntley Archives, and coming out of Jessica and Eric Huntley's work in Bogle Overture and their bookshop that used to be down in Ealing. It is now housed at the London Metropolitan Archives. Autograph, I don't know if you know Autograph, BNP in, is it Shoreditch or something? Shoreditch area, a very important resource center, archive, library, exhibition space, which comes out of the work of the 1980s, Stuart Hall and people like that. Innova is linked to it. Black Cultural Archives in Brixton, okay, everybody should know about that. In front of it is now called Windrush Square, iconically, again, of great significance. June Giovanni Pan-African Cinema Archives, an initiative which I'm involved in supporting. June Giovanni has been curating African cinema all over the world, Black cinema, America, North America, Caribbean, Europe, Africa. And out of her collection, she has now developed this project stroke institution, which is we are trying to establish as a official archive. Okay. The colonial films. These are moving images of the British Empire archives and database. Of course, the British Empire, colonial films, stuff that used to be in the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Empire Office, If you go back to the 1930s, the Empire Marketing Board and all of those propaganda machines and colonial institutions, their archives, film archives, have now been are being restored as part of the British National Archives. Bristol Archives, again a section of that, but housing Empire and Commonwealth collections, mainly photographs, documents. Okay, I was up there a few days ago. Some very interesting, crazy photographs, you know, documents, letters, and all these ex-colonials are handing them their family papers to take care of. So again, we just think about this thing. Down in Cardiff, I'm aware of the African Diaspora Research Project, which I think, again, these are city-based, along with the one in Liverpool, the Heritage Project, city-based initiatives, some by academics, others by community groups, where people are asking people to just write, or tell us, give us your photographs, tell us your story. The other thing about your own story is realizing that the things we take for granted are quite dangerous. I always used to tell students, like I teach screenwriting, about character developing, you know. So you want to, they say, I tell you, the hardest thing is to make a film about your grandmother or mother, the people closest to you. They say, how is that? I say, well, you'll find out how much you don't know about them. And if we think about it in all our cases, you know, and it's not about secrets, it's just the way things are in terms of life. That in order to write a film about your mother, my father, or whatever, we're going to have to do some research. And that research will probably be beyond the family. And we're probably going to have to dig in the family to find things that they didn't think was relevant, useful, or etc. So that kind of thing, or what we take for granted, what we think we know, but in fact what we don't know. So the idea of learning to learn is that awareness of there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot we may be taking for granted. So I also, before we go to come back, okay, keep it there. I also noted that in the context of contemporary Brexit Britain, right? A society greatly defined by racism and Islamophobia, shaped by a history of slavery, colonialism, and empire. An understanding, therefore, of these two terms is what I offered. I suggested that racism, as opposed to race, right, which can't be proved anymore, there's no scientific basis for race. All the white supremacists in America are finding they have black ancestors, you know, and now I hope they go and kill themselves somewhere, you know, it'd be helpful. But they have a problem because the racial purity is a nonsense. From day one, it's a nonsense. And anybody who propagates it is crazy. But when we talk about racism, I want to suggest it's an ideology rooted in the concept of race and which serves to preserve white privilege and a hierarchy of racial differentiation. As an ideology, it serves three purposes. One, it's a safety valve for political tensions and contradictions. Two, it's a mechanism for social control. And three, it's a strategy for maintaining white Euro-American hegemony and power. I want us to just think about it, okay? And when we talk about any system of stratification based on caste, as you have in India, or, you know, something that seems to be inherent, natural, then we begin to see what purpose does it serve. Okay. Islamophobia, coming out of that, like all phobias, xenophobia, for example, and other phobias, it designates a condition of fear, hatred, hostility, prejudice, and discrimination against Muslims and Islam in the global and various local contexts. And it serves the same function as racism. And I want to say this since, I would have, as a qualification, no matter what the British government says and does, let us not forget, Prince Charles today supports a development of Muslim arts, Islamic arts. Okay? The aristocrats, picked tall, we talked about picked tall, the first people trying, they were aristocrats. Most of them, many of them spoke fluent Arabic. They knew what Islam was about. Okay? And they appreciate it for what it is. And people like Theresa May, they're not stupid people. Okay? The best scholars of Islam today are white people in Oxford, Cambridge, when you think about it. They're there for, and if you're going to be a MI5 agent, you become an Islamic scholar. Right? Think about it. To serve your purpose. So they know what the reality is. But it is in their interest then to generate, as they do, overtly or covertly, for political reasons. Okay? No matter what they say when somebody runs a car into Finsbury Park, that's just a slight inconvenience for them, as far as I'm concerned. So, those two terms is what confronts us, shapes our lives and our relationships, whether we like it or not. At that same, in March, yes, I then posed 5 questions in relation to the idea of archives and museums, etc., etc. To ask us then, what is the role and function of these archives? What is the role? Why do we have museums? Why, for instance, as I've said, the French have spent millions of euros refurbishing, reinventing one of their Museum of Mankind, which is anthropology and, a lot of colonial artifacts, etc. Why spend so much money for this? We've had in Washington, D.C., the opening of the African American Museum or Museum of African American Culture, something to that effect. This took 20 years or nearly a whole century to come into being. It's not a recent thing. A grand, amazing building. Lots of money. It's decades to bring it into fruition. Why spend all that time? What is its function? If we go into these places or if we become involved in this work, what are we looking for? Slavery? Shackles? That's the end of the story. What else you want to know about slavery? Whips, perhaps? Yes? What are we looking for? And when we look at this, what can we say about it? What account do we want to offer? What do we want to talk about? What do we want to say about it? Okay? In a lot of African diaspora community, it's painful. So really, why do you want to get back to that? To cry and weep and whatever you want to try and do. Okay? So what account do you want to offer? In other words, what is your intention? And what account it is possible to offer. And what is possible is only dependent on what exists or what is accessible. We have in Europe and America the idea of a lot of documents being embargoed for a certain number of years. They are top security documents, right? So you can't get access to them for another 50 years or 100 years. You might be dead by then. So if you want to write a history and this documentation is not there, you don't have, what are you going to, you can't say it, right? You might assume, but it has no validity because it's not based on anything. So the kind of story you're able to tell is dependent on the evidence that is accessible and available, as well as in the Timbuktu situation, being able to read it. Okay? Okay. Then, how might this account be perceived in the future? So if you leave something as your record of your existence, your academic existence, your interests or whatever, when you are dead and gone and somebody reads this and they're right, Is this what this guy was talking about? Why was he stupid or something? Okay? What perception of this account will be left for the future? And the point I was making here at that moment, and I've done it in times that I've done this presentation in various forms, is to say, we are archive. Whatever we do is the archive of the future, including the selfies, the hashtags, that we don't know where they're going but might well come back to haunt us sooner or later. Okay, but we need to be aware, again, technology and various kinds of mechanisms which we take for granted, and the kind of images that people put of themselves in the internet, and their families, their children, for example. I'm one of those who thinks parents should not put their children on the internet, on it. Let the children do it when they grow big. That's their decision. But as a parent, you should not subject your child to that, who has no consenting power. And I'm not about children giving parents permission to do things. It's about a kind of respect for who they are, etc., and what might happen in the future. Okay? So, these I want to consider as we develop ideas and discussions around the aims and outcomes for today's sessions. And we are hoping that people will be motivated from whichever positions they come from, to be aware of archives, to be involved with it, and the various levels of work that might be possible. This gentleman tells me he's an accountant. Well, I don't expect you to go rummaging in the British Museum, right? Because figures might be your best thing. But the sister here is a researcher, she might want to do that, right? But if you have some money, give it to her, so she has the time to do it. But of course, you can become engaged in a discussion, whether in your family or your friends, about just the meaning and the significance of a museum, the significance and meaning of an archive, and it enhances our cultural life and awareness. Okay, now, stepping from that, in response to those questions, I suggested three perspectives from which those three perspectives are approaching those questions. The first one was the idea of the victim. And of course, this image here is a very famous 18th century picture in Britain. It was invented by the abolitionists, right? Designed by Judge Wedgwood, right? He's famous in British crafts, etc. The name Wedgwood, yes? Decided to produce this to help their cause, their anti-slavery abolitionist cause. Am I not a man and a brother? And the person is enchained and pleading, basically, okay? What would have happened if this guy wasn't pleading but with a machete, a panga, saying, am I not a man or a brother? Right? The picture of the slave as rebel rather than the slave as subservient. Okay? Very different image. Okay? And of course, the Africans who were enslaved were rebelling. Did the abolitionists support those rebellions? I would say probably not. And we could talk about the reasons why. However, the idea of the victim reinforces the idea of the slave and diaspora Africans as being descendants of slaves rather than descendants of humans and of Africans. And you always hear this. We are descendants of slaves. And I say, no, I'm not a descendant of a slave. We are descendants of Africans who were enslaved, or happened to be enslaved. And there's a big a very important distinction here. Okay? The idea of being human is important and central to our existence as African people, in particular in Western societies. Not only that, this reinforces the idea of being at the mercy of white people for redemption. Okay? We can now think about how this communicates itself in contemporary society. The second perspective I offered was what I refer to as the fetishization of blackness. And in most regards, it's an oppositional stance Directly, it offers a narrative of African innocence in the face of a relentless history of invasion and persecution, but it accommodates a fetishization of blackness or skin color, melanin as people will tell you, which serves no real purpose other than to provide an oppositional stance to the demonization of blackness in the racist society. So of course, black is evil. Being black is evil. Skin color, skin shade becomes evil. You know, skin lightening cream is one of the biggest industries in Africa. Okay? So this fetishization is a response to that demonization of black color, symbolizing a certain persona and a certain hierarchy in society. So then we get the Africanists, perhaps, or the Afrocentrists, telling you about, when we were kings, we were great people, we were all kings and queens. Well, not quite. Okay? Not quite. And we need to take that with a little bit of a pinch of salt. And that leads us on to the third principle, which I suggest is taking a principled stand against injustice and for a humanist social vision. And here I make reference, or this principle is grounded in the work of three points. One is the work of Cheikh Anta Diop, very important Senegalese scientist, anthropologist, who speaks about the need for the restoration of African historical consciousness. And encompassed in this is the need for Africans, wherever they are, to not only reconcile themselves as human, or the humanness, but as being part of a continuous stream of history. But it's not a history which sees Africa as some Garden of Eden, which it never was. Africa was never, there's nowhere was a Garden of Eden. Okay? But a dynamic society of diversity within which justice and injustice has always been contested and negotiated. Okay? And that's the human experience. Okay? The second point of reference for this is Frantz Omar Fanon. And you will see his name written as Frantz Fanon. They don't usually use his middle name. But I've put it there distinctly for our context. Frantz Fanon is the seminal, theorist on colonialism and anti-colonial psychology. And for me, I refer to Lewis Gordon, is one of his students, experts on his work, described him as the critic of Western discourses of man. You see where I come back to the humanness, being human? Gordon and people like Sylvia Winters, a very important Jamaican scholar, philosopher and scholar, has used this idea of the notion of man meaning white man. Or being human means white man. If you look at the evolutionists, the theories, you see the ape and you see a white man at the end. Okay? Think about it. That's not an accident. Okay? Africans don't, you're somewhere in the middle after apes, but you become Michael Jackson eventually. Okay. Frantz Omar Fanon, let's stay here for a while. I just want to mention him. Martinique, right? At one time, a very prominent figure in the Algerian Civil War, the Algerian War of Independence against France. Okay? He was an ambassador for the FLNL, right? Pan-Africanist, etc. He carried at one time a Tunisian passport where he was working on the cover. And he had, his first name was Omar, and I forget what his second name in that passport was. What's interesting, he's from Martinique in the Caribbean. He's an African from the Caribbean. And his father's name is Felix Casimir Fanon. Casimir is spelled C. Casimir Fanon. Now I don't want to go into speculation, but here's a family. His brother's name was Felix. Okay, so if that gives us, his mother's name was Madeline or something like that. Okay, but here is a Caribbean family in the early 20th century, 19th century, who is handing down Islamic names. Okay? That's not accounted for anywhere in any of his biographies. Nobody discusses that. Okay? What are the retentions or what are the traditions within his own family that gives him this Islamic name? I mention it because it's something for our further study. Mine as well. For me, it's interesting. But it points to what I will talk about more in the next session about the way Islam and Muslims have been eradicated out of African Caribbean history in particular. Okay. So the third thing is Islam. Islam and its central concern with the well-being of mankind, humans, male and female. And I think we can't lose sight of this. The minute we lose sight of this, we become freaky, let's put it this way, like driving cars into people and things like that. Right? Without stating the real reason why they're doing it. And it's not to do with Islam, it's to do with politics somewhere else, which has its own rationale, its own justification, but nothing to do with Islam. And we need to be able to see that. So, at the root of Islam is, however we codify it, this central concern with mankind, the human. Okay? Right. So, let's look at some of the challenges of moving beyond Google and learning how to learn. And I want here to mention 3 initiatives or projects. These are being highlighted in order to emphasize that the ideas which we are discussing, throwing around, etc., are already being put into practice and debated by the existence of work and people in our community. The issues and approaches, therefore, could be and are already being applied and tested. All what I've said about the questions, the perspectives, etc. These are the things people are confronting already as we speak. And there are 3 projects which I want to note, which I consider to be significant in this way. Slide. Put up all 3. Yes. Okay. Wasi Daniju. I became aware of her work in March. She had an exhibition of photographs on the wall. These were photographs which, I don't know if people remember this. We were a small group here. But I was very surprised because I know her father, her late father, but I didn't know her. Okay? And she has grown up since I've been away, and she's become a photographer. And she made, in all of the photographic work she's doing, at least one of her projects is recording the people of her community. They go to the masjid that I go to in South London, run by the Muslim Association of Nigeria, 3-4 generations of people, a very cosmopolitan mosque, people there from Algeria, North Africa, Pakistan, wherever, but it's owned by, and I used to send my son to the madrasa in East London in the 1980s, where they hired a room every Sunday, to have their own little madrasa. And she has grown up there. And she has now found it necessary to record the women, she says, of her community just by photographing them. Now, I think that's an amazing project. A young woman, she may want to be a professional photographer, or she just liked it as a hobby. But what she is doing is actually archiving this presence, an existence, which otherwise would not be noted. Okay? Kinsey Abdullah, who should be here, her project on the Rio Cafe. A cafe that existed in East London in the early 20th century, organized around which Somali life in London was organized. She rediscovered this not by accident necessarily, but she had to search for it. And if she was here, I would tell her just, not in this session, but as a way of how did you go about finding this research? Because it's not recorded anywhere officially. She had to read through newspapers, read through court records, read through photos, just to say, that's the Rio inside there. This is accepted. And excavate, literally, because the real is not recorded anywhere in official East End history. But here, a young woman who's come here as a refugee in the late 20th century, trying to understand herself as a Somalian refugee coming out of events of, the 1970s, 80s, then discovers a history in Britain of which she's part, and has now to recalibrate her consciousness globally. And if she goes to Cardiff, she will find a community there. If you are Yemeni, you go to Newcastle, you will find a Yemeni community there. All over the place, all these, pockets. If she goes to Liverpool, she will find them there. These are waves of Somali migration over the 20th century in particular, who have left traces of an existence. Somali existence, a Muslim existence. Why not? That's really what we're talking about. There's nothing essentially Muslim about it except these people were Muslims and they lived there. We must, in whatever way they lived. Okay? So that's very important. Those questions are still relevant. The process of finding the information outside of official sources is still important. The last one is an exhibition I went to 2 weeks ago. Young woman, Huda, I don't know if anybody knows. Yes? She came to my attention because she was telling me she had a group of dissidents who used to meet in Rumi's cave to discuss post-colonial studies and anti-colonial this and that. I said, what? Okay. And one day I went up there and sat quietly in the corner. Nobody knew I was there. I had heard them getting on very badly. And I thought, I like this. Yes. But she's a researcher. I don't even know what she does. Is she an artist? Potential. I haven't even said, what do you really do? She's doing a degree or something she's studying. But herself and these other three women, Rihanna J. Parker, Arula Yusuf, and Karima Ali, put together this installation which is at the Tate Exchange. I didn't even know where the Tate Exchange is. Somewhere part of Tate Modern. And what is it? It's a way of presenting the research they've been doing about black women artists in London. Simple. They look at the framework of arts, artists, fine artists, and African women don't seem to feature. And they did their research and they put an installation together in this space. And interestingly, the form it takes is the form of the underground map. The London Underground map? They use that as a way of illustrating various disciplines, preoccupation. Again, it comes back to when you get the information, what do you do with it? They could have written a few paragraphs, very boring stuff, which I'd have to sit hours and read. They have now distilled it into this grid. So you can look at the various lines along the underground map and see who were the fine artists, who were the organizers, who were the, etc., etc. Again, a creative way of presenting information. The bulk of the research is still their work. They will do whatever they want to do with it, develop it, etc., etc. But I mention these three because they exist, and we need to know that things exist. And the value of their existence is really what we're trying to, in a way, underpin here.
Can I just add, there's another project, it's only because we're talking
Yes,
There's another project called Black and Muslim in Britain, and it's a short documentary project run by Mohammed, Sakina Lenoir and Soraya Bey. So they're poets. Sakina's Pals of Islam.
Yes.
And they're doing, what we're doing as well is documenting the stories of
Documenting stories and finding a way to present them, present the material. Okay, and like the British Museum has a lot of information, but it presents a exhibition here, an exhibition here. But the knowledge is accessible.
Yeah. And then some of the projects you've mentioned, and also the Black and Muslims in Britain documentaries, will also be archived within our final archive. So it's going to be.
And what you're doing is
it's
part
more
of
historically.
this. Yeah, and I just mentioned those because they're kind of visual in a sense, you know, and may have been taken for granted or may not be seen. You know, I don't know how many people stopped in March to look at Danny Wassi's photographs. They were a nice backdrop, and I really, you know, I was taken because I mean I have an interest in photography.
We'll be exhibiting them as well.
Good. So that's very important. Okay. So yes. So once we are doing that, I want us to begin to think about a few words. Now it's about meanings now. What do we mean when we say a museum? What is a museum? And I'm not going to give you definitions about this. I just want to throw these out. You know, what is a museum or a gallery? What is the difference between museums have galleries, but there is a museum? Okay? The British Museum, I mentioned Musée de Londres in Paris, you know, the great African American, you know, every country, nation in Europe has a museum. When you look at museums in Africa, and you really have to question what is a museum. Because, you know, what they tell you about the country is the same thing, is worse than probably what they're telling you in Britain, for example. Just in, you know, nobody has stopped to think what is a museum, what is a gallery. What do we mean when we say curating? What is a curator? Okay? And in film sense, it would be a film curator or a film programmer. What does it mean to program? You know, if you're running a festival, if you're running a film society or something at a university, and you're programming or putting forward a film program, what are you doing basically? Okay, it becomes an important question. And this links to the bigger questions of heritage. What is heritage? What do we mean when we say heritage? Of course, there's the Heritage Society, the Heritage Lottery Fund. What really is heritage? Who decides what is heritage? Becomes the other question. And then how does this relate to culture? As I said, culture, some people think culture is the Nike trainers that you wear. But those are expressions or, you know, images of culture. I think culture, the most progressive notions of culture, it tells you culture is about how people live. Right? And how we live is expressed in certain ways. And those certain ways will be the clothes we wear, you know, whether we greet people or not, etc., etc. What food we eat, these becomes expressions of our culture. But they are not culture in themselves, they are the materials of the culture. Then the arts, the importance of the arts. What are the arts? Is music haram? Well, I always used to tell people, let's ban Kulthum, and then we will see if music is haram. Okay? I mean, when you say things like this, who is this guy? He's one of those crazy West Indians. Okay, yes. But no, is it? Is it not? Okay? The arts. What is the function? What is the purpose of the arts? We write poetry, play music, we write novels, you know, and in Arab countries, all the sheikhs now want their pictures to be on the wall and in the newspapers and in the internet. Because they know if they're not there, they don't exist. Suddenly it's not haram. You know. You say, hey, well, okay, fine. Okay. I have a great record collection, vinyl. Okay, so you're welcome to look through the window. Don't get near it. The arts are important, but creativity is what I mean when I talk about the arts. And here, Sister was talking about Islamic education, and I want to throw this as a question to you. In your research in Britain, where it's, you know, I accept what you said about it's quite organized and much more prominently studied than America, are there any madrasas in Britain that teach children calligraphy?
Oh, you're asking me?
Yeah.
No, not that I know.
Can you imagine this? Calligraphy is drawing, is play. The art of play. Okay, you don't want them to draw naked bodies. What do you want them to do? Okay? Geometry is art. Islamic art is founded in geometry and geometric form. Calligraphy is one of the most creative things you can do. No madrasa lets children get a pen and a paper and draw a leaf. Draw a ba and put as many dots as you want. Now think about it.
It's about function and form.
Pardon?
It's about function.
It's about function and form. If you want creative minds, I admire calligraphy. And so, as somebody who's come from a draftsman background, I used to be a design draftsman before I went AWOL. I can appreciate geometric form. But if you want children to learn to write properly, and I grew up, like many of my generation, in schools where people were taught to write. Penmanship, they used to call it, right? Where you spend, just like you do your alif, A, B, C, write it, take your time, okay? Now, you might think for me, it was a creative exercise. And that's what calligraphy is. And if you think calligraphy is art, it's play, why are our children not being immersed in this mind-expanding exercise rather than saying we're not allowed to draw? Well, we know what we're not allowed to do, but what are we allowed to do? And what we're allowed to do, we're not being given the space to do. So, the whole question of art. Lastly, I want to raise questions about these are the kind of things which, when you deal with archives, you're dealing with. You're dealing with archives, archiving. What does it mean? Archival materials, which would include manuscripts, documents, books, audio tapes, audio discs, DVDs, CDs, photographs, artifacts. What is an artifact? Well, somebody will take my shoes in 100 years and say, this was the shoe Imruh wore when he did this seminar. This is a historic moment, okay? But newspapers and maps. Maps are very important. Extremely important. Think about the maps of Africa, for example. Historic maps. If you go back looking at, there are map makers around here, there are people in Covent Garden area who sell maps, old maps. Spend some time looking at maps and the way maps change. And those changes demarcate shifts in history, in conquest. Africa was not always what it is. Nigeria, Guinea, Sierra Leone did not always exist. What did the map of Africa look like before these names were imposed upon them? Okay? Maps tell you, we were talking about the railways, right? What was Africa like or India like before the railway? What did the map look like? And you've hinted some of it. The colonials imposed a new map and the railways demarcated certain points of entry and exit. Okay? So maps are very important because they tell us how the world was perceived and how space was imagined and lived. Okay? Newspapers, as far back as you can get. We're talking about it just now. I won't tell you what we said, but that's your problem. You're in trouble. Newspapers, okay? Newspapers of all kinds. So these are the things we're working with. We've got to become aware that some of this you might find on Google, but they're not on Google because of Google. They are there because they exist in their own right. Okay? They exist in their own right. Okay? And their own, finding that original is important, even in the digital world, where in the digital world there's no original. That's one of the paradoxes of digital technology. We can have an image without an original. Okay, I don't know if any of you doing that kind of studies within your university, but there's a whole way of looking at those things, the idea of the image. photographic image, what does it mean, it's significant, etc. So, all of these, what is the use and role, therefore, of research, the internet, and all the things then we have? Even Google, Wikipedia, this is what Wikipedia tells you about itself. It began in 2001. Does everybody realize that? It didn't exist before 2001. And a lot of the stuff which we talk about only existed from 2000. The internet is quite young, in fact. Right? But it's an encyclopedia, online encyclopedia. Before that, you had Encyclopedia Britannica, you know, the Reader's Digest encyclopedia, all these encyclopedias. What is an encyclopedia becomes interesting. Why did a lot of families in the Caribbean, Africa, all over, invest in encyclopedias? You know the famous encyclopedia salesmen? Right? They give you these volumes of knowledge, perhaps, which people put in homes and hope that they become significant in the lives of their people. Okay? It's an what is an encyclopedia? You know, National Geographic, all these, they put together things they call encyclopedias. Google, Wikipedia is 2 decades old. And we think it's been there all our lives. This is serious. This is really serious, okay? Okay, and therefore, what other resources? Some of the resources are your just talking to your family, your old people. They are resources. Talking to others, generally. You know, refugees, migrants, people from other countries. They are resources. They tell you a story, or they give you some account, which becomes part of the wider knowledge which you then have to work with. Work with is important. So, what are our concerns? And given all of that, I want to suggest that our concerns is the ways in which everyday Muslim life has been represented and archived. This is really what we're arguing here, right? The ways in which everyday black Muslim life, in particular African Caribbean Muslim life in Britain in particular, has been represented and archived. In other words, recorded, preserved, you know, to be handed down. And therefore, how the process of constructing a black Muslim heritage might be conceived. How then can we talk about, you know, we're going to, what are consciously doing, whether it is the Rio Cafe, the videos, Wasi's photographs, etc., etc. How are we, what is the process of constructing this heritage? How will we conceive this work that we are doing? And finally, for this session, for further consideration, the scope within which these concerns might be meaningfully considered. The scope. What do I mean by the scope? There's a woman, a Cambridge professor, Beard, who is in trouble with some of her colleagues because she dared to say that black people existed in Roman Britain. Okay? And the kind of vitriol that this woman has been, I just sit there and laugh and say, wow, hey, this is serious. People take this so serious. The fact that she can say, and the evidence is there, that black people existed in Roman Britain. People won't say, why you mention it? You're making it significant. Okay? And like the white supremacists in America who find out they all have black ancestors, you know, they're now saying, let's go to genetic, you know, technology to see if there are black genes handed down in Britain. Because everybody's worried now. Okay? So, the scope. For me, I don't care one way or other whether there were black people in Roman Britain. You know. My people came from West Africa, they were taken to the Caribbean, they weren't in Rome and Britain as far as I'm concerned. I could take that attitude, okay? It's not, you know, you can see, I can take that attitude. What I'm saying is, one is not taking priority over the other. We are a global people. And that's the whole idea. It is important to establish that presence because it gives a certain lie to certain kinds of things that are taken for granted and certain kinds of assumptions and assertions that are made. It is also important that in understanding our position in Britain, we understand our relationship as African Caribbeans to the Caribbean and to Africa. And whether we want to put Africa-Caribbean or Africa-Caribbean, you know, tells us the difficulty of trying to narrow it down to one thing or the other. Okay? That's not what's important. That we have to understand ourselves globally. The idea of being black in Britain, Caribbean, African, continental African, diaspora African, what that means in terms of identity, in terms of diversity, a word that is being knocked around a lot. I'll come back to that in the next one. The idea of migration and the issue of a global experience. I was in Brighton last week talking about a film, John Campbell's film about migration, The Nine Moses. And I was amazed how the white people in the audience would admit, we don't know anything about migrants, it's all new, we just saw a lot of people come into Britain, we didn't know anything about them. So I had to explain to the dear lady that David Cameron's family inherited a lot of money from the slave trade. And that has helped you and your National Health Service and your amnesia to exist. So you benefited. So when you saw people coming here on the Windrush, you thought they were you didn't know that all the benefits you have in Britain was about cane fields or Indian, the Raj, etc. And she's living next to Brighton Dome, right? I say, have you walked past Brighton? Oh, we haven't thought about that. Brighton Dome, as I told Zaina, she hasn't seen it, is a piece of Mughal Indian architecture in the middle of Britain.
Pavilion.
Eh?
Pavilion.
Yeah, Brighton Pavilion, Brighton Dome, yes. It's called Brighton Pavilion. And it's with great pride that the British people talk about it. Yet when you look at it, you might be next to the Taj Mahal or somewhere, you know. And you think, what is this doing here? But for her, that presence means absolutely nothing. We can't afford to fall into that trap. Okay? Our global perspective must always be maintained. Secondly, Caribbean African Muslims and the engagement with history and the African global presence means finding our place within that. Whether we live in East London, West London, Birmingham, or wherever. We've got to find our place within that global context, not simply within a British Brexit context, which is going to soon be just England. Wait and see. And in so doing, understand that historical journey and therefore taking responsibility for a future, shaping the future vision. And thirdly, how will the value and meaning of any work with archives be determined and by what vision? It then comes back to the 5 questions which I talked about. What stories to be told, how it's going to be told. Okay. So you can see that's the kind of dynamic framework which I want to lay out. So I'll end the first part from there. Shukran, asante sana, thank you very much. That's very, very global, isn't it?